So here's a question I wanted to ask, and it's a little bit of a cut your own throat question. Just like I'm forever recommending podcasts that people could be listening to instead of this one. Very, very, very wise thing for me to do. What are some guidebooks that you've read about writing that have influenced you, and that maybe not necessarily that you aspired to emulate, but maybe had some lessons that you wanted to take and use in writing your own?
Well, I've always loved Bird by Bird. I think that's a really interesting book because it's so practical, and it talks, I think it's a little bit similar to mine in the sense that it shares what she knows by way of stories rather than, here's how you do it. And I just, I love those kinds of books. I like Stephen King's book on writing. I loved Writing Down the Bones, which I found very freeing. I haven't read that for a long time, but for people who have difficulty because they're perfectionists, that they can't write because they think everything has to come out perfectly, that's a wonderful book to read, Writing Down the Bones by Natalie Goldberg, because she really helps you let go of that idea. And there are lots of, little interesting little prompts and things. I read a book years ago that I talk about in A Commotion in Your Heart, which is about left brain theory. It's what is it called? I can't remember it now. It'll come to me in a minute. Gabrielle writing on the no, I'm sorry, I can't remember it. But anyway, Aspects of a Novel by E.M. Forster, John Gardner's On Being a Novelist, which I love. And then I've got a little list here, so I'll just go to this for a second and say, Linda Berry, if you've never read Linda Berry on creative process, she's amazing. I just love her. And those are probably the main ones for me. I like personal books about writing where people talk about how they became writers, when they knew they wanted to write, and their process of not only becoming writers, but the process by which they work as writers. That is absolutely fascinating to me. I love that. So those are my go-tos.
It's just one of those things I'm trying to overcome for myself. And when I'm going to write a new project, one of my first questions to myself was, why should this exist? So, like, if I'm writing a zombie book, there are plenty of zombie stories already. They're
right.
plentifully available. What have I got to say that's new about zombies? I'm never going to do a scary clown, as far as I'm concerned. Stephen King has done the definitive scary clown. The market's sold out. There's no more room for a Rob Kent scary clown. No. But I might do vampires. I could find a non-Salem's Lot version of vampires. So when you're looking at a field that's not stuffed, we always need more writing guides, because sometimes it's not just that the information, it may be information you've heard before, but it's being said in a way you haven't heard it that finally clicks. So when you're looking at a field like that that's got so many excellent options already available, aside from the hubris that every author has to have to write anything.
Doing it. Yeah.
What is it that you wanted to say that you felt maybe hadn't been said, or that only you could say at this time about writing?
I think there are some things in A Commotion in Your Heart that I haven't seen before. And now here's what it is, I guess. Over a long career of teaching writing, I have come to a lot of what I think of just shortcut phrases to say something that people seem to remember. For example, in the book, I talked about trying to make a kid understand why a sentence, sort of what a clear sentence is and why his sentence wasn't clear. And what I was trying to say to him was, the sentence could mean more than one thing, and that you don't want that. You want your sentence to mean one thing. And I tried this and I tried that. I tried something else. And eventually I said to him, it's like fractions in math, the least common denominator in fractions. In the least common denominator, there's no place else you can go. In a clear sentence, there's no other way to see it. And he just went, oh, and I went, oh, because I, in the process of trying to explain to him, that came to me. And so, I ended up having a whole bunch of those kinds of things that were my own little way of talking about writing. And another one of them was, I was sort of talking about it a minute ago, the idea that, that there's this gap between what what you want to do as a writer in a book and what you're actually able to do, and how it's all about trying to make that gap smaller and smaller and smaller. It's never going to be exactly the same, because words are a second language to your heart. All the things that you know and see and think, they're not words. And so you literally have to translate them. And that, to me, that I've never heard anybody else say that quite in the way that I say it. And it's something that, kind of turns the light bulb on for a lot of people and helps them see why it's so hard, and also why feedback from somebody else is so important, because that gap, you can't always see it, but somebody else can. So if that makes sense, I think that's what's in that book, that I haven't seen in other places. And sometimes I think too that a lot of these books have been written by people who are pretty successful, who have been pretty successful as writers in terms of being able to either earn a living or being recognized. And that never happened to me. I've written a lot of books, I've published a fair number of books, but I've never gotten the exposure, and certainly couldn't make a living at it. And so, I'm writing from that point of view of that doesn't always happen to you. And that's something you need to think about and decide how important writing is to you. Would you do it anyway? Obviously I am, so that's an interesting and difficult question. I think that book addresses that I haven't seen other books address.
Well, the good news is now you're on the Middle Grade Ninja podcast for the second time, so fame is on the way. This is the moment.
I'm gonna, really, can't wait.
I like to imagine that every Saturday when a new episode hits, all of New York publishing grinds to a halt. Like, until we listen to this new episode, everything's on hold. Well, I've got a couple of questions for you, because I want to talk a little bit more about fame. You've got a whole section in the back of the book. But before we get to that, you said something else, and there's this beautiful passage from the book that I'm going to read part of your own book to you, if you'll forgive me. Nothing we observe, feel, or know about our own human experience or the experience of others comes to us by way of words, and yet words are all we have to make a story in which living, breathing characters move through worlds that seem as real to readers as their own backyard. No writer has ever had or will ever have all the words needed to recreate the world that was alive in their mind. And I read that and a little light bulb went off. And yes, that is the problem. How do we come to terms with that?
It is the problem. You can't.